Hey. Okay. Okay, so Stuart, this is the dog and pony part.
Let's go.
Okay, so let's just dive right in. So, okay, we're going to talk about 4 things here.
Yeah, one of the things that you have to do is we're going to kind of run through the slides fairly quickly because we're going to have a break for more beer because that's really important. Yeah. And Daryl's got his video going. And so one of the real things is night sailing, get some experience, and crew preparation is really the most important thing, is spend time with your crew. Make sure your crew has been on races before and you mentor the person along. There's nothing worse than bringing a crew member along and he hasn't been on a race like this. We have safety at sea, that's one of the requirements, and there's a number of other things that every boat should be doing to get their crew up to steam. And especially when you pick your crew, watch the personalities, most important thing. It's really good that everyone gets along.
Okay, so quick update on safety regulations, and I'm going to mention a punchline first, and that is hopefully everyone who's doing Straits this year has gotten far enough into the notice of race to realize that Straits is being run using last year's version of the PIYA special regs and last year's version of the offshore special regs. So the Straits Committee decided that because there were very significant changes in some of those regs and they were getting published quite shortly before the notice of race and the race itself, it wasn't appropriate to jam through those kind of changes for the first race of the season. So before I talk about these changes, I just want to make sure you understand most of you are prepping your boats are going to be doing it to exactly the same safety regs that you prepped to last year if you were in the race last year. So, what is the alphabet soup of all this stuff? Well, ISAF, or the International Sailing Federation, which is our governing body for our sport worldwide, they publish what are called the OSRs, or Offshore Special Regs. If you're really old and you've been around sailing forever and you want to make sure everybody knows it, you refer to them as the ORC regs. But they haven't been called that for 20 years, so we're going to call them the Offshore Special Regs, or OSRs. Okay, so in 2013, the OSRs get updated every 2 years. So the last version was 2012-2013. So January 1st of this year, a new 2-year version of the OSRs came out. But again, it's not in effect for Straits race this year. Secondly, Sail Canada, as our national governing body, writes prescriptions that Canadianize or add on to the special regs. And those prescriptions are lined up with the same underlying time period as the offshore regs themselves. And Sail Canada is about to issue the 2014 to 2015 prescriptions. Again, those aren't going to apply to Straits this year. U.S. sailing, this is kind of getting to the bigger news. U.S. sailing got impatient. Well, they had some incidents where they got a lot of helpful advice from the U.S. Coast Guard about elevating the visibility and importance and rollout of safety regs countrywide in the U.S. And then they decided that they weren't going to wait around for ISAF to evolve those regs the way U.S. Sailing and the U.S. Coast Guard thought they should. So basically U.S. Sailing went off, took the offshore special regs and went through and rewrote them dramatically with a view to making them a lot shorter, a lot simpler, and in some cases to lowering perceived barriers to entry. Those regs were announced in the fall. The version of them that's published and downloadable now was effective January 1st, and they're called the U.S. Safety Equipment Requirements, or SERs. Now locally we have PIYA, and many of us have sailed lots of events under PIYA rules, and PIYA had already for years been headed, making the PIYA regs closer and closer to the offshore special regs. So when U.S. Sailing adopted the offshore special regs and wordsmithed them and relabeled them SERs, PIYA finally let go of having its own separate stream of regs or special regs, and it's taken the U.S. sailing special regs and adopted them effective March 1st. I don't want to sound like I'm editorializing, but they couldn't resist, PIYA couldn't resist making major amendments to what U.S. sailing made major amendments to, and so we'll talk about that very briefly, but everybody loves to change the other guy's stuff. None of these new things are in effect for Straits. Okay, so the US SCRs, they took the number of categories down to 3, ocean, coastal, and near shore. One way they got them to be way shorter than the offshore special regs was they took out all the recommendations. So the only thing in the US version of things is the requirements. And unfortunately, because they drafted it at a national level in a hurry, a lot of the wording is very US-centric, so there's very specific references to things like the US Coast Guard, so you just can't easily lift that and use it in a neighboring country like Canada. Now PIYA took the, US Sailing took the number of categories from 7 to 3, and PIYA took it back up to 5. So PIYA has offshore, let me go back. They have ocean, coastal, coastal plus, near shore, and near shore plus. Other than that, there's not a huge amount of changes coming out of PIYA. The big change is switching streams. Oh, people that are old enough to call the other regs ORC probably still have coded lifelines. Anyone? The coded lifelines are now gone, finally. So you don't have to have them off, I think, for Straits, but you're going to need them, get them off pretty quick here because nobody's allowing them anymore. The offshore special regs, there's a whole pile of changes. Actually, most of them are pretty modest changes. I'm not going to itemize our way through them, but this is a list of all the areas that had any significant change at all in ISAF's offshore special regs. And a lot of the changes only apply to a subset of the categories. Straits, for example, is raced at category 3, so quite a few of these changes won't apply to Straits even next year. So the Straits notice of race, it starts off, what's the first line of the first rule? Be safe, have fun, and do your best. And that's a great way to start the notice of race. Safety regs, as I mentioned, everything's based on the 2013. You'll be PIYA Cat 2 or offshore regs Cat 3, that's your choice as a boat. If you're on the inshore course, not to be confused with the short course, but the actual inshore course, then you can be OSR Cat 4 with the local inshore amendments. When you're sailing at night, in Straits, you're sailing under call regs, not the racing rules of sailing as far as interacting with other boats, and that includes boats that are racing and boats that aren't racing. You're required to monitor the VHF for the whole race, and there's 2 ways to comply with that requirement. We'll come back to that. The safety and amendment stuff in the NOR is mostly in section 13, and you got to read it yourself, so I'm not going to try and itemize everything. And finally, Straits Race, like Swiftsure, is strongly recommending that boats have crews with safety at sea training on board. Vic-Maui and Van Al 360 already have that as a formal requirement. Straits and Swiftsure are recommending it. Any quick questions there, just on, because we're going to go away from the notice race. Okay, good. So, Carol, you're doing all right? Okay, Stuart.
Yeah, fundamental rules. When we go sailing, we always follow kind of 3 rules. We always make sure all boats are safe, any other boat in the race. We always make sure we have our personal equipment, so we're taking care of ourselves. We also aren't putting other people in danger to then try and rescue us. And of course, the big thing is the skipper's, it's his decision whether to race. And of course, we ran into this 2 or 3 years ago with the big wind. The most important thing that people forget is that you need to keep an eye on the rest of your fleet, because you're the most immediate person that can provide aid to another vessel in the race. And we ran into this a number of years ago in one of the probably about the third or fourth race. Boat got in trouble, lost his mast. Numerous boats sailed by him. The boat ended up on Werlicum Island, mast down, people in the water, and then up onto the shore. And so it ended up being a big deal with PIYA. There was boats protested, and it's one of the most important things you can do as a sailor is then be aware of everybody else in the fleet and make sure that no one else is in danger. If they are, it's your responsibility to provide aid. It's a really important issue. And that was the Pierce Arrow. So it went right on to Werlicum Island. And one of the sailors that was on that was Peter Salisbury. And just recently he was on Werlicum Island and he has a piece of the head stay foil that he brought back. Quite interesting.
Okay, so boat prep. So you can, well, this isn't Werlicum Island. This is in the South Pacific, so you can put your boat up on the reef and over the reef into the beach in the South Pacific. But we like to think of our waters here as really sheltered waters, but this is what it can look like in Howe Sound and has looked like. So, you know, we can't be complacent to think that we're in short waters here, especially when you're off to do overnight races like Straits. So, boat prep, Stewart?
Yeah, so we have our list. We have our PIYA list. If you want to go through your offshore special regulations, you can use their list. But it's just a matter of prepping your boat and watching out some of the really important issues, which are the major things here. We've had boats in other races in the world where the keels have fallen off. You see a little crack, you know, you follow up on it because conditions can always change. We know that here we've been sailing the last couple of years pretty light airs up to White Islets, but 3 years before that we knew it was nothing but that. So make sure your boat, you're watching the stability, keeping hatch boards in, making sure you have all the gear and follow through the safety regs to make sure you can tick all this stuff off.
Also, if you are going to have your keel fall off, make sure you have a clean bottom.
Yeah. You know, one of the biggest things that people talk about is emergency steering. And as you prep your boat, it's probably one of the things that takes the biggest amount of time and the biggest amount of thought. It's been well proven that on coastal races, you know, you can get by with a spinnaker pole and a little board on it, but if you have to go any distance upwind, you need a serious piece of equipment that's going to steer the boat. On the longboard, we're going through that big discussion right now. The designer figures you can use a big oar, but honest, if you're going to go 2,000 miles up or 1,500 miles upwind, an oar just isn't going to cut it at 3 o'clock in the morning, the 10th day out. So pay attention to your emergency steering. You know, we have a great group of people that have been in these races before, and you know, they can act as a mentor and help you out on deciding what might be the best possible thing on your boat. And the other thing is, I'll just say, is rigging cutting. I'm in the rigging business. You need to make sure that it actually works. So most rigging companies, we're very happy to give you pieces of scrap metal that you can go and try out the equipment you have. You need to really test what piece of equipment you've picked to, you know, cut your rigging. Don't just rely on, okay, we got a saw, it'll work. So really try and use it first.
Okay, and probably one thing that's a recurring theme in Straits races, boats suggesting that they saw other boats whose nav lights weren't on. I did a Straits race recently where I was sailing on a 430 and the next day someone was saying, well, we saw your boat and your nav lights weren't on.
They weren't.
Now I know who. Anyway, nav lights have to go on. No dimmer switches, you know, none of those bar stories, right? You got to have your nav lights on when they're required, which is basically dusk to dawn and any other times of restricted visibility. There really isn't any excuses for nav lights not to be on, or at least no acceptable excuses. So we're going for 100% compliance on nav lights in Straits this year.
And then when you come down to jack lines, that's a really interesting point because there's a lot of boats nowadays have PVC lifeline, coated lifelines on their deck for jack lines. That kind of stuff won't be around and acceptable. One of the reasons, if you look at the new regulations that are coming out that won't be in until next year is they actually say a braking limit that the jack lines have to be. And so it would be, I talked to Dennis at North Sales today, and the majority of the ones that he's made in the last 2 or 3 years don't actually meet the category that's required for next year. So if you're doing your homework, you need to check your jack lines, make sure the material they're made out of meets the spec. Yeah?
What is the spec, do you know?
Approximately 4,500 pounds, but it's written right in the regs. The one thing I'd add to that from my own experience is you want to make your jackline material out of something that's got a minimum stretch when wet. Because if the jackline's stretchy, if it's a 40-foot long run for the jackline and you put it on dry, then it gets wet, now it might have 10 or 15% stretch in it if it's one of the cheaper materials. And the problem with that is that's 5 or 6 feet of stretch, and it allows a person who's on a safety tether to go overboard and basically have way too much stretch in the jack line plus the extension of their safety tether. So when you're going for high load jack lines, the good news is most of the high load stuff is also low stretch.